Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members. My name is Diane Goldstein. I'm a 21-year veteran of law enforcement and retired as the first female lieutenant in the history of the Redondo Beach Police Department, as well as being a proud resident of Orange County. Over my career, I worked and managed both narcotics and gang units. I arrested a significant number of people for marijuana sales, use, and possession. But I came to realize this approach wasn't helping anyone nor keeping our communities safer. Our neighborhoods continued to have widespread access to marijuana while we wasted fiscal resources prosecuting and incarcerating offenders on what I describe as drug lord or drug seller whack-a-mole, instead of going after violent and property crimes. But most importantly, we threw away a segment of our society by labeling them as criminal offenders and limiting their opportunities for jobs and education. My experiences have led me to an important conclusion. We need to replace the failed policy of prohibition and shift our priorities to new approaches that are proven to be both cost-effective to the taxpayer and more effective at protecting the health and safety of our citizens. I'm here representing Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, a group of over 150,000 law enforcement officials and other community supporters who are opposed to the failed war on marijuana. Our members have seen firsthand the devastation and harm caused by the illicit marijuana trade. As the largest producer state of marijuana in the nation, California has been forced to deal with the violence and recklessness of the drug cartels and criminals that operate multi-million-dollar operations in our state. With millions of acres of public lands for illegal operators to hide their grows and a lack of resources to fight back against both the cartels and the criminals and other forces of the illicit marijuana trade, law enforcement continually finds itself outmanned and outmaneuvered in our efforts to control the illicit marijuana market and limits its impact on our communities. It's time for us to take a new approach. This fall, California voters have the opportunity to pass strict regulations on the cultivation and sale of marijuana and give public safety officers the resources needed to enforce the law. The Adult Use of Marijuana Act will create comprehensive controls on marijuana cultivation, distribution, and sales, and raise as much as $200 million per year for state and local law enforcement. Driving under the influence of marijuana is an issue for California today, and especially for law enforcement. And this initiative finally does something about it. It maintains strict penalties for impaired driving, but it will also provide the California Highway Patrol the funding it needs to conduct training programs on detecting, testing, and enforcing laws against impaired driving to keep our streets and our freeways safer. The measure will also fund grants to local government to assist with law enforcement, fire protection, and other local programs to mitigate the impact of the illicit marijuana market. Newly compiled data from the federal government shows that in the years since state controlled, regulated, and legalized marijuana, illegal trafficking in the drug trade has dropped sharply. Our current quasi-legal, unregulated handling of marijuana policy has failed our communities and our state. It has ruined lives and unnecessarily criminalized otherwise responsible adults. Despite medical marijuana being legal in California since 1996 and an ounce or less decriminalized since 2011, we still make over 13,000 felony arrests every year, according to data from the Attorney General's crime report, with a total of over 154,000 marijuana arrests for felonies and misdemeanors between 2010 and 2014. It hasn't kept marijuana away from our children. It hasn't reduced the number of illicit drug dealers or the power of the cartels and the criminals. And it has diverted law enforcement attention and precious taxpayer resources, all to crack down on what many researchers now say is a substance less harmful than alcohol. It's time for a different approach, one that brings sanity and clarity to our marijuana laws. The regulations on the medical market passed last year were an important step, but we must do more to ensure greater safety for all Californians. I respect my fellow professionals who wake up every morning, put their badge on their uniforms, and their lives on the line to protect our communities. But after decades of firsthand experience, I respectfully disagree with some of my former law enforcement colleagues who believe the solution to every problem is to criminalize it. I've learned that with respect to marijuana, criminalization has created far more problems than it's solved. I believe that the Adult Use of Marijuana Act is the best chance for California to end a failed war on marijuana and to reduce the harms of drug trafficking organizations who are operating in our state to generate much needed resources for law enforcement and create a new system of regulation and control that will greatly reduce public health and public safety risks for all Californians.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Janus Norman with the California Medical Association.
How much time?
You've got your 4 minutes. Go.
Sounds good. Janus Norman on behalf of the California Medical Association. We believe the Adult Use of Marijuana Act is a comprehensive and thoughtfully constructed measure that will allow state officials to better protect the public health, clarify the role of physicians by controlling and regulating marijuana use by responsible adults, keeping it out of the hands of children, and allowing for a wellspring of important clinical research on the benefits and possible negative effects of marijuana use. We believe that medical marijuana should be strictly regulated like medicine to ensure safe and appropriate use by patients with legitimate health conditions, and that adult use marijuana should be regulated like alcohol. This measure, along with the recently passed medical marijuana bills, will ensure that the state of California does both, with the public health and public interest being our most paramount concerns. We are further encouraged that this ballot measure will ensure that significant resources are dedicated to new scientific and clinical research to be conducted entirely within the state of California so we can better understand the health impacts of a substance that has not been subject to rigorous scientific review. We also believe that this measure, that a well-constructed marijuana policy will strengthen the current medical marijuana system into which thousands of non-symptomatic Californians are today using improperly in order to be diverted from illegal usage. A safe and legal adult use system makes our medical system, which has been legal in California since 1996, more reliable. We believe that the current medical-only approach threatens the integrity of medical marijuana system and the sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship. I want to be clear so that this question can be answered and put away. So please make no mistake about it. The California Medical Association does not, as a matter of policy, encourage the use of marijuana and strongly discourages smoking of any form. But cannabis is not tobacco. And while the medical research is still somewhat limited, it does appear that marijuana may have an effective and may be effective in certain conditions and provide relief to patients suffering from pain or nausea, for example. I would also like to point out that under this measure, thanks to the legislature, this policy would have the same protections, including increasing the age to 21 and over, and public consumption restrictions that are currently now being applied to tobacco for adult marijuana usage. We are pleased that the measure invests substantial resources in public health education, prevention, and treatment programs targeted at Californians' youth. This represents a significant improvement over the current status quo where illegal, untested marijuana is widely acceptable to young people, but no public health resources are allocated or dedicated for protection or prevention. But perhaps the most important thing to the California Medical Association is this measure gives lawmakers and regulators much needed flexibility to adjust policies and controls as we fine-tune our state's marijuana policy. Too often, far too often, ballot measures create policy that are overly prescriptive and restrictive. Because ballot measures can typically only be changed by another vote of the people, we are often left with bad policy that is nearly impossible to fix, yet alone improve. By providing maximum flexibility to regulators and a majority vote authority for modifications by this legislature, the Adult Use of Marijuana Act is good public policy that represents the beginning of the end of marijuana prohibition in California, but it's just a first step because we are also entrusting that this legislature and our state government with the flexibility necessary to ensure its successful implementation and do it in a way that ensures that public health is of the utmost concern. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for your statement, and thank you all for meeting the time requirements, too, so that we give equal billing to both proponents and opponents. But let me go ahead and just first start off with a question that let me piggyback off a question from the LAO. And as proponents, let me ask about the local license provision, because it seems like in some of your testimonies it was kind of unclear. So if somebody could clarify, do you need a local license or not under the initiative?
Unquestionably, if a local government requires a business license to operate, then yes, you need a local license. It's not the case that the state license can trump local law in this regard.
Okay, thank you. Let me go ahead and open it up for additional questions. Let's go ahead with Senator Bates, please.
Thank you. For Mr. Backus, please. I was curious when you said there were 13,000 arrests for marijuana usage, and I'm wondering if you can break that number down. If not today, can provide some of us clarity on that, because I'm assuming that might have been in the same way that people who are driving under the influence of alcohol and have open containers in their car. So if these individuals, the 13,000 or a percentage of them, were driving under the influence and when stopped by law enforcement might have had marijuana in their possession, if that might have been the reason for the arrest, because that should continue even with the approval of this initiative, if I read the provisions of it pretty clearly, that they're going to be treated the same. So there will continue to be arrests, that you would have to have cause, obviously. So you want to, whoever wants to answer that, because I think we get these conflicting statistics depending on what side of the issue you're on. And we all know that there's dangerous substances, whether it's alcohol or marijuana or whatever, opioids, when people are using those and they're driving equipment or they're working on, in dangerous occupations, there has to be some control and certainly some punishment.
Great. Would someone like to answer the Senator's question, please?
I'll be
Please.
brief. Senator, I heard two things. One is how many of these are DUIs,
Right.
and will the DUI laws be changed? Let's say first, the DUI laws will not be changed. DUIs will be punished as they are now. We will invest more money in proving impairment under cannabis or other substances. The analysis is pretty clear that the majority of the 13,000 felony arrests every year are for possession, for sale, or sale, and that they are primarily young people of color. I can get you those numbers to your office and to the committee.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Lackey, please.
Yeah, I'd like to begin by thanking the joint chairs and members. Think about that for a second. I would look forward to hashing out this initiative today. And to be blunt, marijuana is an important and highly controversial topic that has zigzagged this legislature. Some may say this proposal is dubious, but I think we're here to cut through the haze. And I'll rest at that.
All right. Thank you for your humor, Mr. Lackey. Let me ask additional questions from members of the dialogue. Mr. Wood, please.
Yeah, just a question, actually probably more directed at Ms. Goldstein. So we know in the initiative that there's a provision for $15 million to CHP over 5 years to give money to look at the issue around intoxication and DUI. Do you think we ought to be waiting until we understand what DUI really is before we allow for this initiative to go forward in its legality?
Well, in my history in law enforcement dating back from 1983 to 2004, I worked a DUI team, and law enforcement currently has the capacity to arrest people for being under the influence. Interesting enough is Auto Club just came out with a foundational report that talked about one of the most important things is to get more officers trained as drug recognition experts, similar to what Colorado did. And yes, we should be investing in our public safety, because whether you're driving under the influence of prescription drugs or alcohol or marijuana, we need the best trained police officers out there in order to enhance public safety.
So I guess my follow-up is there currently is no quick, reliable way, and that continues to be a problem in Colorado.
Well, no. Well, what AAA said is the nanogram. Well, I'll let you.
Well, I'm just saying what I heard from Colorado was that there is no quick, reliable way yet.
There is no magic number, no, because the science between alcohol and cannabis, or it's the way it affects your body, is different. But there is impairment training, which is what we actually want to do, is fund improved impairment training, because that's the problem right now, is that an officer can't testify. There's not a lot of training out there about to to explain to an officer what somebody looks like if they've eaten marijuana versus smoked marijuana. So that should be happening now. I mean, that should have happened 10 years ago. Regardless if it's legalized or not, people are smoking and they're driving it on the road. They're going to be driving on the road regardless if it's illegal or not. The initiative won't affect that either way. People will still drive. And so what we need to do is, as quickly as possible, get that impairment training funded and on the road itself.
So there's two types of training. There's drug recognition training, and there's also advanced roadside impairment driving enforcement as well. And, every law enforcement worth its weight in salt has, in fact, trained their law enforcement officers with regard to driving under the influence of drugs. And CHP, when I was in my career, I took my courses simply from them, but I think they are the best agency tasked to handle because of their success out in the roads.
Okay.
And then one final question: the money that would go toward law enforcement that was mentioned in the initiative, I think, Richard, you said that that would be money to enforce AUMA, and so I'm curious: is that money that would be available to law enforcement agencies to enforce against the black market? Or is it just to enforce the provisions of AUMA?
No, it's money that would be used by local law enforcement, not just to enforce AUMA, but other provisions as well, including to establish new protocols, hire additional officers to deal with once legalization occurs.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Thank you. Senator Hill, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of questions, and one to Mr. Norman first. In terms of you made the comment that some of the money that will be collected through the taxes and the fees would be used to conduct the reviews and the research that we've had before. I guess it's kind of strange in terms of a medical or a research process. Don't you usually do the research first and then make the decision of whether this is something that should be legalized or should be then brought to fruition before you then take that leap?
Yeah, well, in this instance, the leap has already been taken for us. When the state of California passed the Medical Marijuana Act, that leap was taken for us. There's been limited research that has been done that has proven that it is successful in terms of pain treatment, nausea treatment, things of that nature. So we know on the surface level, I would say, that it does have some medical benefits to it. What we are really interested is trying to make that research more robust so that we eliminate what we sort of call magical thinking, in which people are saying, marijuana can cure cancer.
I guess I'm looking more at and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I know time is important. I'm more looking at the negative potential health risks involved in marijuana usage, smoking, and along those lines.
Well, again, those issues have to be looked at so that in a medical marijuana context, you can have that discussion about as you would with any drug, about the potential benefits of that use of that medication and the potential harms. In the context of medical marijuana, you don't have all of the research that you need to speak to all the benefits so that you can advise a patient appropriately on when it should be harmed. So that's why since 2011 we have said, look, you need to take it down from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, recognizing that there are some harmful health impacts. That's why CMA does not at all advise anyone to use marijuana or smoking in any form. But we do recognize that there is some benefits there, and the way that we are currently operating the system with regards to adult marijuana is just not working.
Okay, thank you. And a question now on education. On minors. And I noticed the initiative has a lot of restrictions on the use, advertising, marketing. And there was just a recent report, I guess the public health analysis by Stanton Glantz and Rachel Berry from UCSF that kind of lays out a number of issues where they take exception to the robustness of the restrictions on minors, and I also like the idea of amendments and the potential of that are possible. And this is one area where that could apply in the future if we find that there are abuses in terms of marketing or more checks that we need in the system. But the concern I have is, when you look at this, the industry that's going to be created from this, or that's already in existence, and then I look at the difficulty in this building and the political and powerful influence of tobacco today, or of alcohol today, in this building, and what I see as the potential for that same level of power and influence in this building from marijuana legalization. How do we look at, and I guess it's a rhetorical question, how do we expect ourselves to be able to make those changes in the future if we see problems existing?
Well, I think I would refer you to the robust authority given to the regulatory agencies, and their paramount, again, I would just bring it back, their paramount duty is protection of the public health. So if there's a situation where you have these entities that are coming in, that are lobbying the regulatory agencies to try and loosen the very restrictive limits we have on advertising to minors, it would be the agency's duty to deny that type of request. So I think it starts with the agencies and their perspective when adopting the regulations, ultimately to implement the law. Of course, then, as you mentioned, the legislature does have the authority to amend the law to add even more robust provisions against protection for minors and things of that nature. So I think it starts with the regulators, really, and then goes back to the legislature.
Thank you, and I think there's and the initiative allows that discretion for us as a legislature. Mr. Ridley Thomas.
Yes, I don't know if I missed this, but are there anticipated costs to the court system as a result of the resentencing associated with legalization in the initiative as currently drafted?
We looked at that issue, and our understanding of the numbers is that the reduction in the workload on the courts more than offsets the cost for resentencing.
The administrative cost for
resentencing.
And is that included in materials that were submitted?
Materials that were submitted, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that assertion that you just made, do you have a treatise or a document associated with that that's been submitted? So anticipated reductions, if you have something, please send it to us. With respect to the felony arrest, I'm not sure what year that comes from. It would be interesting to know. In Los Angeles County, from what I understand, we are significantly focused on other things besides trying to get people on marijuana charges. So, for example, in a report that I read from the NAACP and Drug Policy Alliance did in 2010, it focused on LAPD and African Americans in particular at a high percentage. The last couple of years, from what I have observed, and it'd be interesting to hear if you all have different information, is that we've really been focused on the suppression of crime, particularly in the summer, and have redeployed significant resources associated with those spikes in crime in various contexts, primarily in violent crime related to gangs. So if there's a possibility, if this 13,000 felony arrests pans out proportionally to the state, the third would be in LA County, that the focus has frankly been associated with other violent crimes, and may have been marijuana charges leveled to it. It's not very different from what Senator Bates indicated from her perspective with respect to DUI. So I suspect that if it's the case in LA County, our resources are really, from my observation, and if you have information to the contrary, I'm more than open to hearing it, that we're not trying to track down those who are dealing with behavioral and substance abuse issues, but really that we're looking at violent crime and pervasive instances of such that are plaguing communities. Do you have any response information?
Yes, I'll be brief. It's laudatory to focus on violent crime and crimes where there's victims. The 13,000 number is low. So it's 2005 to 2014, 13,300 is the low end. It's gone up to 17,000 and more most years. So that was the low end, is 13,000, and it's statewide. I will try and get you LA-specific information.
Lastly, I would encourage, as I said in my remarks, and thank you to the Chair for the extended time for questions, but that, frankly, going through the legislature, though difficult, is preferable because you can vet out these issues and you can separate them because they are different impacts on different communities. And frankly, just to the proponents, as one who represents a portion of a community that if this goes wrong will feel it most acutely in South Los Angeles, I am quite irritated by having a one-size-fits-all state solution that we'll have to go and negotiate with everyone in this body and the governor, whomever that may be, this one or the next. to figure out how to fix it, because if it goes wrong, and we've seen things go terribly wrong in Los Angeles, even with medical marijuana, it will be ugly and it will be acute, and very few people who are proponents of this bill or this ballot measure will have to deal with those effects. Those who live in those areas, including this representative, will have to deal most acutely with those challenges with a bad regulatory scheme for legal marijuana. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, and I think Mr. Ridley Thomas's was pretty clear with his opening remarks as well, and especially as we move forward. I do know that the initiative does allow some discretion to the agencies and for the legislature to play a part in that as we move forward. Let me go ahead and remind the members that we are now 9 minutes over, and I believe Mr. Rodriguez had a question, please.
Just a real quick question. I haven't really looked at, as far as the effects, what happens to the first responders in Colorado, being it's already legalized there. So how do we cope with the increase of cost for service? Because I already, as you know, I still work in that industry part-time, and that I look at this aspect. If we legalize it, what does that do to our EMS services, our hospital services, as we may go out for more calls for service, that people in a sense may overdose, so to speak, where we're getting more increase of calls for service from our first responders? How do we look at handling that, and then the impacts they may have in the hospital setting as well?
I'll take the first shot at that. The issue is not that there's an increase. The issue is that people then start to talk about it more. So currently, due to the fact you are criminalized for using cannabis, if you go to the ER and you've overdosed on an edible and you're too high, you don't admit that. What they found in that states where they've legalized it is that people start admitting it. They come to the hospital and they say, yes, this is what's going on. So you do see a slight bump, but it's because people are now being honest about what's going on. They do put in, with that said, there is resources resources in the initiative to address those issues, but the reality is that you don't necessarily see huge increases. In fact, a study just came out this afternoon showing that in legalized states that there's actually a reduction in small tick down in youth use, and that's because when it's fun for mom and dad to use it, it's boring for the kids in a lot of areas. So you don't see the massive increases. People are just more honest about it.
Can I just address kind of marijuana-related crime specifically in Denver, because I got this report from the state of Colorado. In 2012, they had 170 industry-related crimes, and non-industry related, a way that maybe somehow got tied into marijuana, 50. In 2015, they have 183 industry-related crimes, with burglaries dropping from 130 in 2012 to 114 in 2015, and 69 non-industry crimes. So that's a total of 252 crimes for the city of Denver, which is a very, very large city, that were specifically identified as being marijuana related. I think that there has not been that uptick in crimes. And one of the things that I'd like to say is when it comes to looking at Colorado crime, they recently changed to what's called NIBRS, which is a different reporting system than the UCR. And so they don't have any pre-legalization assessments with the NIBRS stats, and so now that they're identifying more calls for service because of a new system, but they're not seeing those upticks in crime, and I think we need to be real careful and look at this on a year-to-year basis.
Got it. Thank you. Let's go ahead and move to Mr. Quirk, who had a question.
Yes, from Mr. Matich. So my colleague was concerned about L.A. and South L.A. Can you relate what the local discretion is in these areas?
Sure. The initiative maintains full, I want to be very clear, full local autonomy with respect to adult use marijuana. If Los Angeles does not want it, Los Angeles does not have to have it. If Los Angeles only wants to permit retailers and not cultivators, they can do that. If they want to ban the establishment of adult use marijuana businesses entirely, they can do that. It is full local control.
Got it. So is that your understanding under Chapter 20 then on page 38 of the initiative? That's what allows that authority?
It's section 26-200, I believe.
26. Okay. Thank you. Hearing and seeing no more questions, let me thank everybody for your time and your patience and for your testimony. let's go ahead and move to our presentation by opponents of the initiative. If we could bring up Sean Rondo, Government Affairs and Public Safety Specialist with California Peace Officers Association. Lauren Michaels, Legislative Affairs Manager for the California Police Chiefs Association. John Lovell, Treasurer, Coalition for Responsible Drug Policies and Legislative Counsel for California Narcotics Officers Association. Connie Delgado, Chief Legislative Advocate for California Hospital Association. Bishop Ron Allen, President, CEO, Founder, International Faith-Based Coalition. And Carla Lowell, Founder, Citizens Against Legalizing Marijuana. So let me just remind everybody here, if we can stick to, I believe we have 5 minutes allotted for each member on your testimony. Will allow time for members to ask questions afterwards. I do want to keep this to be fair and balanced. I know the proponents stuck to their time. Let's try to stick to our time as well with the opponents of the initiative. So let's go ahead and begin with Sean Rundle with California Peace Officers Association.